website. Or
we're only getting one response back. It seems to be quite perhaps common amongst this group. So this is really kind of that opportunity or place where you could document, again, your procedures that you did, where it was posted, who you sent it to, how you tried to obtain an adequate number, and again, your efforts towards that. Oh, and then I'm sorry, we actually talked through these as well. And then we had gotten down to, was a preference provided for the purchase, acquisition, or use of goods or materials produced in the US. I was going to go back to the federal excess and surplus property. So during the break, I was kind of doing a research there. I got to one site where I think you can like check out their auctions and things of that nature. Our IT system wouldn't let me go any further because it considered it to be an online auction site. So I think it is a way that you can get there pretty easily if like I just Googled federal excess and surplus property. So again, I don't know exactly, what kind of property is on that. I assume it varies depending on what they end up in their inventory, how it gets there, things of that nature. But again, just another source, another consideration. All right, and then asking that question of, was a preference provided for the purchase, acquisition, or use of goods or materials produced in the United States? All right, some of these, might be NA. No, because it's a service we're purchasing, right? So it is okay if in some of these situations you're answering, the NA, because again, it will depend on what it is you're procuring. All right, and then it asks the question about contract price and type. So how was a contract price determined? Again, usually it could be because, well, that's what they quoted us in their proposal. We both thought it was reasonable. And so we went with that. However, if there is, again, some of that negotiation back and forth, this prompts you to say, attach that communication with the vendor around the negotiation. And then what type of contract was entered into? Oftentimes, again, it's a fixed price, set of time and materials, or is it cost reimbursement? All right, and then this is a section that kind of prompts about those disadvantaged business affirmative steps. All right, so again, this is asking, did you take the steps? Yes, if no, or I'm sorry, it asks a question of, was this a disadvantaged business? And does it fall into that definition? You can answer yes. If no, and if they weren't solicited, if they weren't on your list, right? Explain why not. Maybe we went to the SBA website. There weren't any vendors in that industry, in our geographic area that met our needs, right? Just again, a short explanation of, well, you did take the affirmative steps to consider them, but it just wasn't possible to use them or to include them in our solicitation list. All right, this one, is more kind of organization specific or entity specific of, is this purchase included in the budget or approved by the finance team? Maybe that's changed to accounting team, whatever it is named internally, if needed, right? So asking the question of, is it already included in your grant budget, right? That's something you're going to want to be considering. Now, whether it needs additional approval, internally, again, that's something that might be organization specific, but I like to have it on this checklist just to kind of, again, prompt those questions. And maybe actually now when thinking about this, maybe I kind of segregate that into two different questions. So I might revise this checklist before I send it out as a resource, but I think both questions are kind of worth asking. All right, and then at the end of the checklist, all right, which vendor contract did we select for work? Clearly name them and state them. Some additional kind of best practice ones, then, was a contract or agreement, has it been executed with the required provisions, right? Making sure that gets done. Did you receive a form W-9, right? Again, that doesn't come from the uniform guidance itself, but as a contractor, you should be receiving their W-9 so they can get a 1099 at the end of the year for their services. All right, and then was a suspension or debarment checked online, right? So this is where it prompts you, okay, let's go out to the sam.gov and do that check. All right, and then what was the date of the purchase? Then, the individual, again, this comes down to kind of those internal controls of who's preparing this checklist, who's the one actually out there kind of purchasing, and then who's approving, saying, yep, we did this all in compliance with the procurement regulations, yep, and then signing and dating. You might want to think about internally, who would make sense to be that preparer, who makes sense to be that approver. Probably makes sense again, or depends on what the procurement transaction itself is. All right, and then I wanted to cover some of those contract provisions that should be included in your formal contracts that you might have with a vendor or contractor. So Appendix 2 to 2 CFR 200, or the Uniform Guidance, lists out a number of different provisions that may or may not be applicable to what it is that you're procuring. Some of them are applicable to pretty much any purchase. Others are applicable at either certain dollar thresholds or to certain types of contracts. So we'll talk through those. The ones that are really applicable to all contracts would be, again, that debarment and suspension. So it says that for all contracts, the entity shall obtain from the contractor certification that neither the contractor nor any of its principal employees are listed on the excluded parties list system in SAM. I've seen this both be just a clause, right? Again, saying by signing this agreement, you are certifying as such. I've also seen it as a separate actual certification. And I've had to do that myself in response to RFPs where you're actually certifying on its own form. We're not suspended or debarred. Drug-free workplace. For all contracts, entities shall obtain from the contractor certification that it complies with government-wide requirements for drug-free workplace. Domestic preference for procurement. This is one that in that new subsection, it does say that this should be included in all your contract agreements as well. That, again, as appropriate and to the extent consistent with law, that the contractor will, to their greatest extent practicable, provide a preference for the purchase, acquisition, or use of goods, products, and materials produced in the U.S. Okay, and then once you get to contracts over $10,000, there needs to be a termination clause that basically says, or all contracts in excess of that 10,000 shall contain suitable provisions for termination, including the manner by which termination shall be effected and the basis for settlement. And in addition, such contracts shall describe the conditions under which the contract may be terminated for default, as well as conditions where the contract may be terminated due to circumstances beyond the control of the contractor. Oftentimes we'll see these termination, provisions or clauses in pretty much every contract, regardless of the dollar amount. But here the regulations are saying once that contract gets to 10,000, you really should have that as a provision. All right, and then if you enter into a contract over $100,000, any contracts, or I should say, or a subaward of $100,000 or more, a certification should be obtained from the contractor or subgrantee that it will not and has not used federal appropriated funds to pay any person or organization for influencing or attempting to influence an officer or employee of any agency, a member of Congress, officer or employee of Congress, or an employee or member of Congress in connection with obtaining any federal contract, grant, or other award. Again, this should be a provision in your contract. I've also seen it. I just submitted a proposal in response to an RFP where they made us sign a certification at the time of submitting the proposal and addressing the Byrd anti-lobbying amendment. All right, and then contracts over 150,000 shall contain a provision, and all these different thresholds kind of go back to the act that the requirement is coming from, right? So for the anti-Byrd, the Byrd anti-lobbying, not anti-Byrd, right? That comes if you dig into the 31 USC 1352. That's where the $100,000 is coming from. This one, the Clean Air Act and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act, that's the one driving the $150,000 threshold. Right, so any contracts and subawards of amounts in excess of the $150,000 shall contain a provision that requires a recipient to agree to comply with all applicable standards, orders or regulations issued pursuant to the Clean Air Act and the Federal Water Pollution Control Act. If there's any violations, it says you should really report those back to the EPA. So that's a provision that needs to be in over 150,000. And then once you get over the 250,000, now this one, it does actually refer back to the simplified acquisition threshold, which is, as we know, is currently at 250,000. So all contracts for more than the simplified acquisition threshold must address administrative, contractual, or legal remedies in instances where contractors violate or breach contract terms and provide for such sanctions and penalties as appropriate. All right, so those are ones that have to do with thresholds. These have to do more with kind of what the contract would be for. Telecommunication contracts. This was something new with the revisions to the Uniform Guidance in November of 2020, where there is a prohibition on certain should stress, telecommunications and video surveillance services or equipment. Really, it comes down to any telecommunications equipment produced by Hawaii, if I'm pronouncing that right, Technologies Company, or ZTE Corporation, right? You cannot enter into a contract that would procure or obtain equipment, services, or systems that use telecommunication equipment or services from those two companies. All right, contracts for construction. There are a number of them that kind of need to be included if there is construction being funded with your contract. Equal employment opportunity. So all contracts that meet the definition of federally assisted construction contract must include the equal opportunity clause. Davis-Bacon Act. When required by federal program legislation, all prime construction contracts in excess of $2,000 awarded by non-federal entities must include a provision for compliance with the Davis-Bacon Act. It says when required by federal program legislation. Certain programs will require the Davis-Bacon Act, or we'll say that is applicable. So I'll say not just all construction contracts is Davis-Bacon applicable. It's very specific to what program is funding. Okay, I'm gonna actually jump back. Andrew has a question. How would you search or confirm the potential subsidiary companies for Hawaii or ZTE? So I'm gonna jump back to that one. That's a good question. I'm thinking maybe a web search on that. I've never looked into that much further. I haven't had a lot of clients that have actually had contracts for telecommunication equipment or services. But I think it would take another step further. And that's kind of I'll just kind of segue now. Kind of when you're thinking about overarching regulations as it applies to grants and grant funding, right? A lot of times you might see reference to a certain agency regulation or a certain, federal code of regulation. And it doesn't necessarily explain kind of what that is. It is kind of on the grantee to kind of dig in further, right? Because the awarding agency, pass-through entity, they're actually required in many situations to only make reference to the regulation, right? Now, some of them are nice enough to kind of put an explanation of what that means within, the terms and condition, but really, they could just say, and I've seen it many times, right? As a grantee, you're subject to 2 CFR 200. Okay, and that's kind of it, right? As an administrative requirement. Well, then it's really on them to dig in further. That was a kind of a long way to kind of answer. I think this is maybe one of those situations as well. I kind of wish that they would have listed it out. But this is maybe one of those things that, if we're getting into telecommunication, we kind of really need to dig in further. What is their subsidiary or affiliates? Unfortunately, I don't know them offhand, but I do think perhaps a web search could kind of get you to that information.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. With the Davis-Bacon Act, usually you would know if your program is subject to the Davis-Bacon Act. It's a grant term and condition that's pretty stressed pretty heavily. So it should be kind of front and center of, okay, our funding is subject to Davis-Bacon. Now we need to follow that. All right, and then Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act. again, where applicable, if the contract awarded in excess of 100,000, there's another little threshold in there. So it has to be a construction contract over 100,000. If it involves the employment of mechanics or laborers, you need to include a provision for compliance with 40 U.S.C., the Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act, which the Department of Labor implements. All right, and then this is that Buy American Act that I had mentioned in the morning session, right? So for all contracts for the construction, alteration, or repair of any public building or public work in the United States, that includes acquisition of steel, iron, and manufactured goods, a certification shall be obtained from the contractor confirming that the contractor has not been convicted of violating the Buy American Act. And that clause will also should be included that the contractor's acquisition of steel, iron, and manufactured goods with funding provided through the contract is subject to the requirements set forth in the Buy American Act. So again, this is one where it's very specific about if the Buy American Act is applicable or not to be confused with that Buy America preference. This is one where the act is very specific about if it's a repair for any public building or public work. All right, and then there's, oh, I'm sorry, that bullet point should be updated. Let me make a note on that. All right, so there's a rights to inventions made under a contract or agreement. So any contracts or agreements for the performance of experimental, development, or research work shall provide for the rights of the federal government and the entity in any resulting invention, right? So some of these are very nuanced, very specific. I don't expect you guys to be able to regurgitate that information back at me and tell me what all those provisions are. More or less when I go through these trainings, and this is kind of true for any topic that we just discussed, right, is that you kind of remember, oh, there's something about that, or, oh yeah, there's those provisions, you know, that we need to know when we need to include in our contracts, right? I always recommend having a templated contract that is used for federal procurement, right? That makes sure that it flows through the proper terms and conditions, but at the very least, kind of having an appendix with these provisions so that you start with it pretty comprehensive and then you can pull out those that are not applicable, right? Rather than trying to insert the ones that are applicable. Usually it's kind of works the best if you just start with them all and take out the ones you don't need. So that's usually what I recommend, is just to have like a templated contract for federal procurements, if that kind of works with your typical, you know, legal contracting process. Okay, here's a few questions. All right. Is it true or false that you can bundle purchases with federal funds to get a more economical price? All right, making notes of a few things that I know I need to update here before I send out the final PowerPoint. Okay, everyone's answered true. You guys are correct. You can bundle purchases if it results in a more economical price. All right, next question. How many different procurement methodologies does a uniform guidance allow for? Is it 2? Is it 3? Is it 5? Or is it 7?
Five. Room has suggested 5. Rebecca.
All right. So far, that is the, oh yes, I see 3. You guys are all correct. It is 5. In fact, when the new uniform guidance first came out, I was kind of chuckling because I used 5. They actually used a graphic of a bear claw, and they had each methodology as a different, I guess, bear finger. I'm not sure why they went to the bear claw, but that is actually what the OMB did at first when they would do their own trainings on the uniform guidance, the procurement claw, which I thought was just kind of funny. All right, and then small businesses, minority owned and women-owned businesses must be used. Is that true or false?
False. They don't must.
All right, that is what I'm seeing. Yes, everyone answered correctly. False. Kind of a trick question. It was really reliant on the word must be used. Affirmative steps must be taken to consider those businesses, but it does not mean that at the end of the day, they must be chosen as the vendor. All right, another question. A suspension and debarment check must be performed or a clause included when procurement contract is how much? Is it $30,000, $45,000, $25,000, or $50,000?
I'd say 25. 25, everybody? Yes. We're gonna go with my age, Rebecca, 25.
Correct. Wait, who said the age 25? Was that you, David?
Yeah, that was me.
All right, 25,000 is correct. Good job. However, does everyone remember what the best practice is on every procurement, right? But the actual regulation is 25,000. Okay, moving on to vehicle purchasing. All right, so this is just vehicle purchasing process overview. And I would really like to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to kind of add comments, thoughts, open up for discussion about this process. Because again, I just want to make sure that everyone's kind of questions and things are addressed. So first step is the agency, the sub-grantees would alert the New Mexico MFA about the need for a vehicle. So that would happen in the November, December timeframe. And the agency would obtain bids and complete and submit the WAP vehicle purchase bid analysis form, which I'll go over. We have kind of a templated form that you guys can use. Then MFA would go and obtain approval from the DOE. The New Mexico MFA is actually the one to purchase the vehicle. And please, I want to make sure that if I am misstating anything about this process, that you guys jump in and correct me. That the agency then, however, is the entity to manage and use the vehicle. The New Mexico MFA is the one who actually includes that vehicle purchase, however, in their monthly expense reporting. And then the New Mexico MFA is the one to properly dispose of the vehicle. I see some discussion. I saw a thumbs up. Was that David and Troy approving how the process as written?
Yeah, we do make the purchase as the agency, but the provider actually goes and pays for it when we issue them a check. So just to clear that up, we are the lien holders and they are the purchasers.
Okay, I must have interpreted that differently when we were discussing through that. Okay, so the agency is actually the one, and then does that show up on the agency's monthly expense report for that month?
Show up on.
No, it's on the capital outlay from your budget, and then accounting makes the check to the selected vendor.
Okay. Did you hear that?
No.
No.
So are you talking about when you say manages the monthly expense, are you talking about amortizing and amortizing?
I am, but I want to maybe jump back up into the process a little bit, where I was under the understanding that the New Mexico MFA is the one to actually write the check, actually purchase the vehicle from but then the vehicle itself would go to the agency for management and use in the program. Okay.
Yes.
Got it. So how it's written here is accurate. Okay. sorry, that I thought I had just misheard that the agency actually is the one cutting the check for the vehicle.
No, you got it. You got it right.
Okay, well, great. Well, then, okay, so then the New Mexico MFA, yes, you're the one who includes it in your monthly expense reporting, and whether choosing to put it all in one monthly purchase or to amortize it over the life of the vehicle. All right, and then the vehicle, is this true that then actually kind of possess, or MFA then is the one responsible for figuring out the disposition of that vehicle with the DOE and making that, in charge of that process, I should say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Most of the time it would be like a trade-in process though, when we dispose of vehicles. The only time I guess we would have to dispose something would be like a blower door or something like along those lines, but usually vehicles are traded in.
Got it. Yep, and I should clarify, disposition is just kind of the terminology for, okay, it's done being used for this program, right? Or the program has gotten to the end of the period of performance, or whatever it might be, for the time, so the time period in which program needed it has ended. Then they just term it as disposition, and then you reach out and say, okay, what should we do with it next? And oftentimes it is, okay, trade it in, something like that. But you always go back to awarding agency to get those instructions.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. So talking about vehicle purchases, right? Well, you need to ensure that the procurement guidelines are complied with. So everything we just spent the last couple hours going over, right? You need to make sure that you're properly procuring that vehicle purchase. You need to obtain at least 2 quotations for the vehicle purchase, right? So that's kind of best practice. Now, if it's, maybe we should talk through this. So what if a vehicle is at $8,000? And then it kind of comes down to more internal practices, right? New Mexico MFA, would you still require of your sub grantees and your agencies to go out and get at least 2 quotations? Usually, I mean, that's the best practice with a vehicle purchase. Again, if it's obtainable, going back to the comment of there's not a lot of inventory out there, right? So I think this is something that needs to be discussed. Is this pretty much a program requirement that you are requiring agencies to get at least 2 quotations when possible, even if the price is under 10,000?
Under 10,000?
I don't think I've had any vehicle under 10,000 for an example since I've been here, so I don't know the answer.
Okay, I just wanted to ask the question in case it comes up that since we got everyone in the same room, right? That everyone's on the same page of what those expectations would be. You're right, usually vehicles would be over that, but if you're in that instance, just wanted to see what kind of your internal requirement around that would be.
It would be under 10,000, right? So would we still need 2 quotations if it was under? We would just need
approval.
We would just need DOE approvals, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, per the regulations. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right, and then I just wanted to reiterate, the bids and quotations received should be in writing. And then you should complete a bid analysis form. So we put together a template that helps you document all of the needed information, right? And this will be provided as a resource after today's training. And it is in an Excel version. So you'd write, okay, what is the agency name, right? What contract agreement number is this under? What are the vehicle required specifications, right? Basically, what is the information that you sent to vendors that would clearly define the requirements? Oftentimes with vehicles, it could be a little more straightforward of what you're looking for, whether it be a pickup truck, a van, right? That can do X, Y, and Z. It doesn't have to be super lengthy, but even whatever you sent out to the vendors, you can kind of document here. All right, and then what were the quotes that you received, right? And the copies of the quotes should be attached to this form. What was the vehicle make and model that they proposed? What was the vehicle cost that they quoted? Did the price quote or proposal meet the required vehicle specifications, right? And this is kind of your opportunity to say, oh, they quoted a whatever vehicle it is. It's just really not going to meet what we need. It's not big enough for, you know, whatever it might be. Here's where we can say no, so that you have that justification of, you know, why you did not go with that vendor and help justify why you went with another vendor. Gives you the opportunity to write any additional notes or comments on the vehicle quote or the vendor to be considered for analysis, right? Sometimes there's additional context that you want to have documented, right? Then an actual line for clearly saying which vendor you selected, which ones you did not select. And then if there's additional justification for the vendor that was selected, right? Here again, it reminds you lowest price or best value selection due to other factors, right? Oops, didn't need to quite go on. All right, and then here is where the agency representative, you know, actually signs in dates. To say, yep, you know, certifying, yep, this is a bid analysis that we, or these are the quotes that we got back, and here's our analysis of them, right? And then this should be turned into New Mexico MFA so that they can have good documentation for then going and purchasing that vehicle from the vendor that was selected. Now, again, I do kind of want to go back to that question about timing, knowing that this is a very kind of time sensitive process. So I don't know, maybe based on past vehicle experiences in the last couple months, is there any kind of advice or best practices, David and Troy, or any of the agencies that you've seen, or anything that can help speed up this process, really anything that can help facilitate that time crunch that you'd like to discuss?
As it
Speed it up, I don't think there's really a way to speed it up. If the dealership that was, yeah, the dealership approval.
That's the first thing is if you find your truck on the lot,
You would need like.
you have to have like.
You know,
you
send
have to
email
have
to Troy,
approval.
send that out, it gets back by 2 hours. You can say, okay, yes.
So that they don't sell it.
Yeah, because even, I mean, we've had instances past years, I mean, you guys know where this truck's been waiting there,
Well, we lost the whole RFP because the truck was on, we
Yeah.
had to go up
Yeah.
and back up last year.
They sold the truck and we had to do the whole thing.
I think, Rebecca, what we're saying is we're at the mercy of DOE and their approval. When we, you know, the providers give us what we need, we submit it, and you know, all we could do is just hope that DOE approves it within the next few hours. I mean, it's almost like minimum is probably like a week period. You know, sometimes it could take longer, but I think that's what the consensus is it's, you know, we could probably buy a truck if we had DOE approval and it was on the lot, and our accounting team can issue a check, but
If
that's
DOE had a pre-written approval for a certain amount of vehicle, you'd be able to go in there, and I mean, you guys get the check in a week or so, I mean, you gotta get it pretty quick, so that would be a.
Well, yeah, because then we already have the approval letter and say, okay, we're gonna buy this truck, and if we commit to it
Yeah,
and say, we're just.
They'll hold
waiting
it
for
for
the
a
check,
week.
they'll-
that's when you get their bid in, you're waiting 2 more bids in, and those 2 other bids don't get here for another month or so, that
Or
truck's
people
gone.
saying no bid.
Yeah.
did you catch any of that?
Yes, and I'm kind of wondering, I want to go back to the slide on the process. So understand, you're kind of giving, all right, so you're already aware of the need for the vehicle purchase. Is there any communication that can be done with the DOE, kind of giving a heads up so that they're kind of teed up to know, hey, we're going to need your approval, you know, in the next day or so? Or is it really, is it more just kind of a just-in-time thing where, oh, yep, we need a vehicle purchase, and then MFA is reaching out to DOE and hoping that they turn it around kind of as quickly as possible? Is there any kind of heads up that can be given?
So DOE emails us the approval, and I've asked for like an approval sheet, and our DOE rep at the time says the email is sufficient enough. for our accounting team to issue a check. So I guess if we come up with some sort of promissory note to the dealership that if, you know, the vendor or if the providers take the vehicles, they'll have their check within, you know, 2 or 3 days or something like that. But I guess we could come up with that kind of system.
Sure.
I will say that DOE has not approved a vehicle yet. They've only asked us to provide more information or to refine what we've done for procurement. There was the instance that Isaac had described where it took several weeks, and I think it was just horrible timing because they might have been thin on project officers and overloaded with work. But since then, I let them know that the vehicle was sold out from under us. And since that time, they've been doing whatever they could to turn it around as quickly as possible. And so it's just a working problem. We don't really have a solution other than to try and turn around as fast as we can without sending them a package full of mistakes, of course.
Sure.
So it's just a problem.
Yep. Got it. Well, it sounds like, yeah, you've done everything that you can. So hopefully the situation may get better where it's not as low of inventory, but I guess until that time, yeah, it's just trying to manage that process as quickly as possible. Like I mentioned, we'll be sending out this as a resource to be used. All right, they're talking about vehicle or, you know, because it meets the federal definition of equipment management. All right, so the regulations say that equipment must be used by the non-federal entity in the program or project for which it was acquired as long as needed, right? And so that's really whether or not the project or program continues to be supported by the federal award. And it says the non-federal entity must not encumber the property without prior approval of the federal awarding agency, right? So really, if you bought it for that purpose, supporting that program or project, it says really you can use that then as long as your program continues, right? Whether or not the funding from us is still there. All right, and then when the equipment is no longer needed for the original program or project, then it says the equipment may be used in other activities that are supported by the federal awarding agency in the following order of priority. All right, so the first preference. All right, so the equipment must be given to other programs or projects supported by the federal awarding agency that finance the equipment, right? So if you no longer need it for your WAP program, but the Department of Energy is giving you funding for another program, right? Well, if you could use it over there, they're saying, okay, that would be our first preference. You can't use it for our program that it was funded with. Is there another program that we're giving you money for that you can use? Then use it over there. The answer is no. Well, then the second preference is it should be given to programs or projects under federal awards from other federal awarding agencies, right? Okay, well, if you can't use it on any Department of Energy programs, how about if we have a Department of Health and Human Services program. Oh, we can use it over there. Then that would be their second preference. It says also permissible is used for non-federally funded programs or projects. And so that's kind of first preference is funding agency programs, second preference, any other federal programs, third preference is any other project or program that you could possibly use it on. All right, and the regulations say that you must actually also make the equipment available for use on other projects or programs currently or previously supported by the federal government, provided, and I think this is key, that such use will not interfere with the work on the projects or program for which it was originally acquired, right? So if you use your WAP funding to purchase the truck and, oh, we could also use it on our DHHS program. Well, they're saying, okay, that's fine. That's great. Get more use out of it. But it can't interfere with why you originally purchased it, right? So if it's just sitting idle and you have other use for it, that's fine. But really, first preference is the intended purpose for purchasing that equipment. All right, one of the administrative things that's kind of tied to equipment purchases is having really good and robust property records maintained. And they need to include a number of different pieces of required information. So things like a description of the property, a serial number or other identification numbers, such as a VIN number, the source of funding for the property, right? What awarding agency and which grant number did it come out of? Who holds the title to that piece of equipment, the acquisition date of the equipment, and the cost of the property, the percentage of federal participation in the project cost for the federal award. You know, oftentimes it'll be 100% that they purchased it. Sometimes it'll be 50%. They paid for half of it, right? So that just needs to be very clear in your records. The location, use, and condition of the property. And then any ultimate disposition data, including the date of disposal and the sale price of the property. You need to make sure that those records, the records you have all that information. Sometimes if you have a property management system, you know, there'll be plenty of different fields or, you know, data entry points where you could have it all. I've seen many clients have a separate spreadsheet for this, right? Where it literally just has columns. And that's fine too, right? That meets the definition of having those robust property records. All right, other management requirements. So a physical inventory of the property or equipment needs to be taken and the results reconciled with the property records at least once every 2 years. Now, really this requirement is just for equipment purchased with federal funds, right? I've seen many organizations, however, kind of take on, if they have a lot of equipment purchased with federal funds, let's just do an organization-wide, you know, asset inventory. It's best practice anyways. But truly the regulations are just speaking to the equipment purchased with federal funds. All right, you need to have an internal control system in place and developed to ensure adequate safeguards to prevent the loss, damage, or theft of the property, right? And so adequate safeguards is going to depend on what it is that you're purchasing, right? If it's a vehicle, making sure that it's in a location that maybe if you have a gated-in area, a garage, of course, is best. At the very least, making sure the doors are locked, right? Just making sure that you have the safeguards to help prevent that loss or damage or theft.
I'm just curious real quick, has anyone experienced the loss of or theft of vehicles in the last year? Just curious.
Nobody in the room.
Okay, yeah, we had a problem with that. To your point about adequate safeguards, we had one agency in the same 18-month period had 2 of their work vans stolen, and the second one under some questionable circumstances, and some folks ended up being dismissed. I was just curious if anybody else had that situation. Supposedly they were under the house in the crawl space, but nobody was wearing their Tyvek suits, and it was anyway. Yeah, just curious.
We didn't have anybody in the room, but one of the providers did have a trailer stolen recently, but they do have they do park their vehicles in a very secure location. Some of them even rent out additional storage for their vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's good.
Sorry, Rebecca.
No, that's a very good question. I'm kind of curious too. So thank you for posing it. I'm glad that nobody answered yes. That's good. All right. And then also adequate maintenance procedures developed to keep the property in good condition, right? Whether that means routine oil changes for vehicles, whatever it might be. Try to keep it in the kind of the best condition possible. And then to ensure that proper sales procedures are established to ensure the highest possible return. If you're at that point of disposition where the agency, pastor entity says, yep, go ahead and sell that, right, then you just need to make sure that you're trying to get that highest possible return. Okay, then talking about vehicle disposition. Right, so as at the agency level, you can consult with New Mexico WFA when any of the following occurs. So if you no longer receive WAP funding, if the vehicle no longer works, right, if it no longer works prior to the end of the estimated useful life, if it has reached the end of the estimated useful life, right? So at that point is when you kind of triggers it. Okay, let's reach out to New Mexico WFA. Oh, go back this. And then really at that point, it's about that discussion of kind of going through those stages of, okay, well, depending on the state of the vehicle, can you use it for other programs? You know, and kind of going through that checklist of, okay, what next? WFA may have to reach out to the Department of Energy too, to get their take on, okay, well, here we are, here's a situation. What would you like us to do with this fan? Really, that's kind of the first step. It says, reach out to your awarding agency. They'll let you know what to do with it. So just remember that these triggers is you do need to reach out to New Mexico WFA and just ask the question of, okay, now what? All right, and I think I'm going to turn this slide over to Andrea. Talk about some resources on procurement that NASCAP has.
Yeah, thanks so much, Rebecca. And David did mention, I just want to let everyone know that they do need the room back at 10 till, so we'll be absolutely able to get you out in time. We wanted to also leave time at the end for Q&A, but I just wanted to remind folks that we do have some resources, you know, to Troy's point about the time it takes for DOE to give the vehicle approval. We had a few states contact us last year, really struggling, like seeing 9-month approval processes and pulling their hair out. So we had worked with DOE to do a webinar on vehicle equipment procurement and disposal, and said, you know, one of the pieces of feedback that we had from a few states were, you know, we get everything together, we ship it off, and they tell us we need one more thing. And then we ship that off and we wait 2 weeks and, oh, we need one more thing. Like, could we just have a checklist of everything you need and we'll go down? So that was another thing that DOE delivered to us and we shared with the membership was, okay, ask everything at one time. So on our member portal, and I know both Troy and David and anyone else at the state have access to this and they could download and share with everybody else, but there is the presentation officially from DOE on the vehicle and equipment procurement and disposal. The checklist, which I've heard from a few folks, seems to be working well and is speeding up the process on the approvals. So feel free to use any of those that you need. And then we also had a request from a state to develop a vehicle amortization schedule template, and that's just in the next slide down there, Rebecca. That's also available in the WAP resources under procurement. And so for states that are utilizing in their state plan their separate direct cost category of vehicles and equipment, if they're selecting that as a separate, they have the opportunity, instead of having to amortize that vehicle in 1 year or during one grant cycle, which is short, they can amortize that vehicle over its useful life if they use that separate direct cost category. Otherwise, it has to usually be absorbed in program operations, and then this doesn't apply. But for states that utilize that category well, this is just another tool in the toolbox. You know, in that first box that we showed on some of the things that NASCAP produces, this is a tool and resource available to anyone to help them try to figure out their amortization schedule in the useful life of vehicles. It's available to anyone, so feel free to use if it's helpful. And then before I turn this over to open Q&A, in the next slide, I just wanted to remind everyone and welcome everyone, should you be available September 25th through the 29th, we'll have the second week-long training conference, and this will be in Grand Rapids. Michigan is our host state. So it's applicable to state staff, to sub-grantee staff, and even to contractors are welcome. We should be opening up registration probably in the next 30 days. So there's a link there where you can stay tuned. And Rebecca, you're welcome to come join us too.
I look at my calendar to see what I got going on
Oh,
that week.
good. Yeah, absolutely. We'd love to have you. So that's there. Stay tuned for more details. I know we had, some comments came back. We're seeing so many new state staff. I think at the winter conference when we said who's new, like 60% of the room raised their hand. We couldn't believe it. So some of the feedback we got was go back to the basics. The new manager training was over my head. So we may be having a pre-conference that's just called Back to Basics, WAP 101. Let's start, with the basics, which could be, really in-depth overviews of 10 CFR 440 and even going over, 2 CFR 200. Jonathan's famous old joke, how do you navigate WAP? You keep your hands on the wheel at 10 and 2. So stay tuned for more details on that. And then I want to thank Rebecca. It's tough to do, almost, 6.5 hours of virtual training. Thanks to all of you for staying in the room, for staying online and being participating and being with us all day. And especially to Troy and David for taking the initiatives to secure this training and make sure that everybody has access to the good information. So with that, I just wanted to open this up. Everyone has been unmuted. And if you'd like to just ask any basic questions, you've got Rebecca, certified CPA, on the line. And, feel free to ask some open questions. It's a good time.
So real quick, I just wanted to clarify that I wasn't trying to bash DOE by any means. We have a great relationship with our representatives. So it's not a stab at them. It was just trying to clear up some of the challenges that we've had in the past. So DOE did a great job, and I think they're getting even better. So I just wanted to clear that up.
Oh yeah, I didn't take your comment that way at all, David. And we all have room for improvement. And certainly, if there were states out there trying 6 and 9 months to get approval, there was, looking through that lens of continuous improvement, there was an opportunity there. So while I don't know if it'll ever get as good as real time, hopefully it does continue to improve. And hopefully I can only imagine, you have to have vehicles to do the job at the local level. The frustrations that some of the sub-grantees and even the state have had to go through with the supply chain shortages. So hopefully hang in there. It's going to get better soon.
I just want to say thank you, because I've got a government procurement background, and coming from a CPPB NIGP certificate holding person, I was kind of lost. I want to make sure that compliance, like they say, stay off 6 o'clock news, right? Compliance is a big deal. The shoulds and musts and how it's interpreted by other people is very difficult. So I thank you guys a lot for doing this. Anytime you have it, please invite me. There are always good questions in the room.
Thanks, Rich.
Yeah, thank you, Rich. And thank you everyone for all your good questions throughout. With compliance, actually do a whole session just talking about the importance of grant compliance, right? And I like how you said that, stay out of the 6 o'clock news. I always bring up, you don't want to get in bad media press. But yeah, and how many times does it take you to hear kind of the same thing over and over until it sticks, right? That's an actual thing. And so I'm a big proponent of trainings. And so I just want to say, kudos to New Mexico MFA for setting this up, because really you're then helping your, supporting agencies make sure that they have the proper understanding and know what to do to be in compliance.
So how many times do you have to hear something before it sticks? Because I might be on the slow end of that stick. I feel like it could be.
It depends what it is.
Yeah, that's true.
And how much you like your career.
Yeah.
I really like doing this, So for me, if I want to work beyond ICAST, if something happens, I need to stay out of the news.
Well, that sounds like a good session title for our next compliance training that we
6
do.
o'clock news.
Stay
That's-
off at 6
I
o'clock.
worked for a family, basically. The husband and wife were both government procurement officers in Fort Lauderdale in South Florida. And he had been doing acquisition back since the Vietnam War. So they were very, very hardcore about being compliant with things. And she drilled it in me, like, do not get caught doing something stupid.
Yeah, that could be another session.
Yeah, I belong to the Single Audit Resource Center, and they have a Friday email, talks about all the different fraud cases, and waste and abuse, legal cases that came out during the week. And you'd be surprised at, or sadly, I'm not too surprised at the stories anymore, but it's shocking what people either think they can get away with, and it comes down to just having good processes in place and good internal controls, right? A lot of times it's not caught because there's not the controls in place. And so someone can get away or think they can get away, with misusing federal funds or being out of compliance. So
I watched a guy get arrested who was a site supervisor who was also working for the contractor. He's doing 24 years in the Florida State Penitentiary because they could not prove how much money he took, but he lost everything because of it. Like all of his property, personal property, and everything's all gone. His retirement is done.
yeah.
Well, I mean, that was a blatant case of ignorance, though. That was. I know what I'm doing. I knew what I was doing. I even had his mother involved in that kind of situation.
Yeah. Yeah, and sometimes things can happen where some of the service providers may think they're doing something that seems kind of simple and innocent. Like we had a situation one time where a service provider decided to go away from being crew-based, and instead we're selecting contractors to do the work. So they had all this equipment left over, and blower doors and infrared cameras and good grief, whole bunch of stuff, insulation blowers. Anyway, so they have a yard sale, and they don't record it. I get a call, kind of a whistleblower call, saying, hey, they just sold like $35,000 worth of equipment and threw it in the general fund. And I was like, oops, talking about your, the disposition and making sure that you keep that, if you're using an Excel sheet for your equipment and inventory. Anyway, so we found out we had a little gray area in our policies and procedures at the state for the WAP, and we added in a little extra definition around how you dispose of equipment. But yeah, you can.
Well, thank you for sharing those stories. We do have a question here, and Troy has the question.
Thank you, David. So I have an announcement and a question that are both related to each other, and it's kind of weirdly based off one of the last things that Rebecca said. So I'm gonna start the announcement and then I'll proceed to the question. Yesterday, Donna, who was our Deputy Director of Programs, and myself met with a fraud awareness outreach person that is hired by the Department of Energy that just so happens to live here in Albuquerque to oversee the various grants that DOE has. Weatherization is only a tiny portion of that. He's mostly overseeing Sandia Labs and Los Alamos Labs. And he met with us as part of what DOE is doing with all of the grantees, particularly with the bill funding. And what he wanted to do was schedule a training for New Mexico. So that's important for you, Andrea and John, because the rest of the network is probably going to be contacted as well by their officers. And he wants us to reach out to all of the recipients for this training. So not just the executive directors, but the QCIs, the assessors, finance, anybody who touches money for this training. It's not a monitoring, it's educational. And this happened during ARA, by the way. So one of the questions I had for him was, what is one of the pitfalls? What do people get caught doing? Or what do you see that's common? And his response was stuff being billed that never happened. That was the very first thing you said. So that's related to this, and that my question is, what would you say is the biggest pitfall of procurement with weatherization? And that might be for Andrea, John, and Rebecca as a team. What have you seen agencies or states missing that ends up causing harm or ends up resulting in some substantial work to correct those problems?
Yeah, Andrew, do you have one specific to the weatherization program? Otherwise, I can probably give a couple just kind of general federal grants management pitfalls with procurement.
Sure, that sounds good. And then I'll follow up just with what I saw from my tenure.
Yep. I mean, I'd say overall with procurement, when I'm thinking of it from the lens of where the most single audit findings kind of come from, right? Not having a robust procurement policy in place, and not having corresponding procurement processes set up, right? To really be in line with the requirements. A lot of times the number of quotations or just what methodology and what those requirements are, right? That's oftentimes an afterthought of, oh shoot, we needed to get 2 quotations, right? Well, by that time the goods or services already purchased. So that I would say is probably the biggest pitfall, is just not, right? People don't know what they don't know. And so if they don't know what they need to get to properly document that, that good or service, right, that's when you get into trouble come audit time, is not having that documentation. So I'd say really not obtaining the proper number of bids or quotations, which we saw a lot with, unfortunately, with the relief funding, right? A lot of funding was going to a lot of organizations that are new to federal funds. They didn't know the rules. They hadn't looked into the rules, didn't obtain proper training. So they're just then getting their money. They're going out and buying stuff. And then they're getting kind of into, you know, issues come audit time.
Thank you. That's informative.
Yeah, I was going to say about the same thing. My experience was we were seeing a lot of, you know, in at least in Georgia, we kind of had a separate fiscal group that did the auditing and the compliance. And so we were getting all these reports back that a bunch of the agencies were having fiscal findings. So we were like, well, we need to get in front of this instead of behind it. So we, you know, one of the things that I had asked, we were seeing a lot of issues with not having enough bids returned. So we created a checklist, basically an RFP. Does it have this, 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 and this? Did you send out, you know, rather than just posting an ad in the newspaper, which no one looks at, did you have a list of contractors that you contacted, at least, you know, 12 in your area or something like that? And then just for a period, a few years, I actually reviewed every RFP and signed off on them to ensure, so that way we caught it before it went out versus after, so that we didn't have official findings. And so it was a lot of work, but it did work. It had, I think, a positive impact. So.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm.
That was the IG's office, by the way, that we met with. Just to give you a heads
Who
up.
is it? What's the guy's name?
His name was Matthew Ray,
Okay.
but I believe he said that he takes care of part of Texas as well, but it's mostly New Mexico is just enough. So every state might have their own officer depending on the DOE activity in that state with all the various grants they have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But he'll go through a pretty extensive fraud awareness presentation with us that can teach us what to look out for so that we're not blindsided.
Let me know what you think of it. I know a fellow by the name of Eric contacted Oklahoma with the same offer, and they were looking at that. And then we were thinking, Jonathan and I met with that guy, Eric, and encouraged him to submit a session proposal. We just had one on fraud, waste, and abuse, but frankly, with so many new people, you know, and the impacts of having the OIG have a negative report about WAP because of something can be so big. So, you know, having it set, just like Rebecca said, sometimes you need to hear things 3 times before anything sinks in. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think that wraps up the questions in the room. Again, I just want to reflect on what Andrea said was to Rebecca. Thank you for providing this training. You are definitely worth every penny. I appreciate all the poll questions, Andrea and Jonathan. You are wise beyond your years, and we appreciate you. And thank you everybody for attending. And if we have no other questions, then I think we can conclude.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone. And I'll be sending over the updated PowerPoint. I was just going to make a few clerical adjustments. And then that analysis form and that procurement checklist too. Those will be resources for everybody.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that. And David and Troy, we have a little work on the back end here with the recordings and then getting them publicly. Probably he puts it on YouTube or something, but it may take a day or two before I can get you access to that, but it's coming.
No worries. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you all so very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Guys.